Our show today begins at the Department of Economics here on campus at the University of the West Indies. If there is a genuine willingness from world leaders to begin addressing climate change, one of the first and biggest challenges will be dealing with the side effects it will have on various economies around the world, including Trinidad and Tobago. Our very own Prime Minister addressed this upon returning from Glasgow.
Those changes are not going to come overnight in the way that some people are asking, but changes are coming. We have to continue to sell as much as we can because that's what we live on.
But when what we live on is beginning to threaten the very way we live, it can give world leaders a huge headache of satisfying both the planet's needs and people's needs. I've come to Dr. Marlene Attzs, a developmental economist and lecturer here at the University of the West Indies, to talk to her about the challenges that governments and world leaders face in putting the planet first and people first. Dr. Attzs, thank you so much for accepting our invitation into your office.
You're welcome, most welcome.
We know that Trinidad and Tobago's economy is highly dependent on, right now, fossil fuels and hydrocarbons. What are the implications if we don't diversify away from these hydrocarbons?
Well, I mean, you said it, Ryan, at the start in terms of the introduction. We're heavily dependent on the hydrocarbon sector in terms of oil and gas. That is the mainstay of our economic profile for Trinidad and Tobago. So the challenge for us now is twofold, if I could say, both in terms of climate change mitigation. How do we as a country reduce our carbon footprint? So it is said that we are one of the highest emitters of greenhouse gases, and not to discount that statement, but to put it in context, simply because of the heavy dependence on the oil and gas sector and the hydrocarbon sector, and the size of our population being so tiny, 1.4 million. So from an arithmetic perspective, it comes out pretty big. So, but that being as it is, Trinidad and Tobago is seen as contributing to the emissions of greenhouse gases. So, of course, what we're trying to do now is to manage our carbon footprint, to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that we emit, and there will, of course, cause to be a conversation about energy transition. How do we move away from non-renewables into renewables? And some of those conversations are age-old. So in the last budget presentation, there was a conversation around electric cars. There was a conversation before that about older vehicles, about CNG, et cetera, et cetera. So we've always had the conversation. But now there is some urgency coming out of COP26 and the attention that has been given by the world to countries that are emitters. What are we going to do next? So enter the conversation again on economic diversification. But for us and for other small island developing states, the conversation is not an easy one. So for us in the Caribbean, Trinidad and Tobago is known as the oil and gas giant. What do all of the other Caribbean countries do? They're either heavily involved in agriculture or they're heavily involved in tourism, both of which also are extremely vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So there was an interesting presentation by the foreign minister from Tuvalu, one of the small and developing states in the Pacific, where he stood in water and he says, a country that is submerged in water, is it still a country? That is essentially, I mean, that was melodramatic, but it essentially paints the picture of what could be the fate of small island developing states in terms of climate change if we don't get the warming down to controllable levels. These are some of the impacts. You can see countries being submerged, losing parts of their land mass, and small and developing states already are small, surrounded by significant amounts of water. So for us in Trinidad and Tobago, the conversation is on the one side about mitigation, which involves in part a conversation around diversification. So we mitigate and we reduce our carbon footprint, and we diversify into other sectors, which also are vulnerable. But then for us, there is another side to that conversation, the conversation around adaptation. So how do we anticipate the impacts of climate change and protect our people, protect our economy from those impacts? So it's a very complex conversation moving forward.
If within the next 3 to 4 decades, this is something that we don't rigorously deal with, what are some of the industries that will begin disappearing in Trinidad and Tobago?
Well, disappears is a strong word, but I think it makes the point. So the obvious ones, the tourism sector, for example. And tourism is going to be affected or could be affected in several ways. And we've seen some of those impacts before in the Caribbean. So in the 1990s, 1995, etc., there was a string of hurricanes impacting on several of the Eastern Caribbean countries that are heavily dependent on tourism. So the tourism sector, there is something called storm surge coming out of climate change. If your seas get too warm, you can experience storm surge. I did some research in Antigua back in the day, and I witnessed hotels that were devastated as a result of storm surge. Storm surge, 10, 15, 20 feet coming in and essentially just taking away entire parts of hotels. But we know in the Caribbean, what do we sell as our tourism product? Sun, sea, and sand. So the closer you are to the beach, the better it is from a tourism perspective, but that is extremely vulnerable. The agriculture sector, of course, is also vulnerable because you're going to have changing weather patterns, you have uncertainty, you don't know when the dry season is going to begin, when it's going to end, when the rainy season, etc. And that is going to pose threats in terms of crop management and produce and food security. And these are some of the indirect impacts that we can find ourselves facing from climate change. So oil and gas, vulnerable in terms of the winds of change that are blowing across non-renewables, including the fossil fuels, agriculture vulnerable, tourism vulnerable, manufacturing, while vulnerable to a lesser extent, is still vulnerable because we import many of the inputs that we use into our manufacturing sector. And as I said, whatever happens to the rest of the world can, in fact, impact on what is happening to us here. So I think what we need to do is that we need to engage in some planning to identify what are our risks, what are areas of vulnerability, and to essentially craft national policy to help us come up with a national adaptation strategy for how we move forward. And that will also involve, of course, retraining, reschooling, what we teach our up-and-coming generation. So you talk about 2050, we're certainly not going to be the leaders, the movers and shakers in society at that point in time. So we need to start a plan from now in terms of what we feed, with the diet of education that we feed our younger persons so that they can be prepared to navigate the national space in years to come.
You mentioned plan. We've been hearing about diversifying the economy for many decades, but how imperative is it that we begin diversifying this economy in this decade?
Can I say that the imperative was last week or last year or 10 years ago? I think, not to be facetious, I think COP26, one of the things that I was very pleased about in terms of the coverage is that it brought a renewed sense of urgency. Having prime ministers and leaders from around the world speak to COP26, I think brought the sense of urgency that we need to do something and we need to take action now. And for us in the Caribbean, small island developing states generally, but certainly small island developing states in the Caribbean, that have so many other challenges. So we have economic challenges, we have the challenges imposed by the pandemic, which until COVID-19, we thought climate change was the greatest threat to Caribbean small island developing states, but now we realize that there is a pandemic. So we have a myriad of issues that we're dealing with and a myriad of challenges that we're dealing with. So the urgency is there for us to have a plan, because climate change has been described in the literature as a slow onset disaster. You never know when it is going to take its toll. So we might experience heavy rainfall that can lead to severe flooding. I mean, we saw that a couple of years ago when we had the significant flooding that affected Greenville and disrupted livelihoods and disrupted the country and led to significant loss. That is perhaps just a small example of the kind of impact that climate change can have on economies such as ours. So we need to be prepared, and we need to be prepared now, because our economy relies on it, our people depend on it, and livelihoods depend on it.
Experts say that there is a cost that comes with climate change, not just the social costs that you've mentioned, but economic costs. Have we already begun paying in Trinidad and Tobago?
Well, the economic costs will begin, of course, in terms of your transition. What is it going to cost your economy? When we talk about, if you contemplate for a moment our previous budget speeches that always talk about government earning X amount of millions of dollars from the energy sector. And when prices decline or when production decline, it results in Y amount losses by the government. You're talking now about transitioning your economy and pivoting almost completely eventually into another sector. So there is going to be a cost associated with that transition, the opportunity cost in terms of what other sector can you go into, what other sector can you invest in. But you're already challenged. In the case of Trinidad and Tobago, you're already challenged in terms of financial resources. We know the stories of how much the government has had to engage in borrowing because of the shortfalls in revenue from the oil and gas sector, how much they've had to engage in borrowing because of the unforeseen costs associated with the pandemic and providing for the health sector to ensure that the health sector had the wherewithal to manage, to grapple with the pandemic, but also to deal with the social fallout as well. So there are going to be costs associated with transitioning, that diversification that we talk about. It is going to come, there is no zero cost. So one of the things that I imagine the government will be contemplating is, even as it considers transitioning away from the energy sector, and that is not going to be an easy feat. That is something, I mean, as we mentioned, we've been talking about diversification for years. That is not going to be easy, because you're going to have to gradually wean yourself off of the energy sector and into new sectors. So perhaps the conversation taking place at the government level now is, how do you finance that transition using resources from the energy sector? So for us, we are in a peculiar situation. We need the energy sector to help us finance ourselves out of that energy sector and into a more diversified portfolio, so that we can at least try to ensure some economic sustainability for Trinidad and Tobago.
Dr. Marlene Attzs, thank you so much for taking some time out to chat with us.
Oh, you're most welcome.
Indeed, and a really great conversation with Dr. Marlene Attzs of the UE. Coming up after the break, you don't have to have a crystal ball to see that a food crisis is looming across Trinidad and Tobago. Our South reporter Radica De Silva has been speaking to farmers who are calling for urgent attention now. Climate change has put global food security at risk, affecting not just the quantity of food, but also the quality. Rising sea levels and global warming of our oceans have also had an impact on our fisheries stock. In the South Oropouche drainage basin, saltwater intrusion have caused the death of livestock. Estuaries on the western coast at Gordono and also Claxton Bay no longer teem with life. Across several parts of the country, flooding, dry spells, pests, diseases, erosion and loss of biodiversity have impacted on productive farming. Our South correspondent Radica De Silva has been speaking with farmers across the country who say that the agricultural sector needs urgent attention to address this looming food crisis.
Climate change is already impacting on food availability, as some fruits and vegetables have been in short supply this year.
So the plants and the bearing part of it changed a lot. Like for instance, when the mango season, you ain't get mango this year because of all that. Then plus the locusts is part of the problem. This is Diwali time, no shatta nowhere because of the same thing, climate change.
Farmers say high operating costs, soil erosion, pests, loss of biodiversity, and limited access to agro-technology have impacted negatively on productive farming.
With climate change, we as farmers, we are seeing that our produce are not bountiful and the harvest is not as we used to be. Like for example, we know avocados this year didn't come the way it's supposed to be. It have a lot of people that plant tamarind here, and the tamarind itself, that it didn't even bear as even half as maybe years before.
Frequent dry spells in the rainy season have dried up ponds, and in the earlier months of the year, devastating floods. At the Kunjal Food Project in Barrackpore, where farmers cultivate 300 acres of land, President Navin Prasad says they've been forced to dig deeper into their pockets.
It has been a real burden for farmers in terms of paying for truck-borne water, running irrigation systems in times when they didn't need it.
And apart from floods and dry spells, there has also been a proliferation of pests caused by climate change. Livestock farmers and fisherfolk have also faced losses over the past 2 years.
Last year in Woodland we had salt water coming up, and it covered the grass with the salt, and cattle were dying because of what was happening. That saltwater intrusion is unprecedented in that woodland area. The amount of saltwater coming up on the land, not necessarily in the river. And then we have, with the heavy rainfall in 2017, we had one farmer alone in Barrackpore losing 5 cows because she could not get to them the level of flood water.
Last week, retired Dean at the Faculty of Food and Agriculture at the University of the West Indies, Professor Wayne Ganpat, called for immediate action to be taken to address the impact of climate change.
Thank you very much, Radhika, for your excellent reporting on this story and throughout this series as well. Coming up after the break, should nature have rights? Trinbagonian Justin Sobion has been making the case and will present it to us next.
I would like you to close your eyes for a moment and imagine a world without trees. Well, you probably won't have enough oxygen in your brain to even think or imagine a world without trees.
Welcome back. We're back in studio now. Should nature have rights? In the same sense that humans have rights and we term it human rights, should nature have rights? Environmental lawyer Justin Sobion has been making the case. He joins us from New Zealand, where he's based. Justin, thank you so much for joining us and for really, accommodating us despite the time difference.
Oh, that's no problem. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
You've been making the case, and a strong case as well. You've got this incredible TED Talk that everybody must Google and see. You've been making a very strong case for nature to have rights. Tell us about it.
Yeah, I mean, the case is not a novel one, really, for nature to have rights. This goes back and till since 1970s. It was a book written by Christopher Stone, American lawyer. Do trees have standing? Meaning, do trees have legal standing before courts? The rights of nature, I've been following these developments, and this is more than 50 years ago. The rights of nature is really recognizing that nature has its own intrinsic rights, just as how companies have rights or consider a legal person, just as how persons in Trinidad and Tobago, not until maybe the 19th, 20th century, could not have been allowed to vote, for example. So the rights of nature is just realizing that nature has its own intrinsic rights and value, which is independent of what nature can do for us. It's not, we're not really saying what could you do for nature. We are saying that nature has its own inherent rights that should be recognized, because life is a web of connection, and we are all in tune with nature and nature in tune with us.
You know, you're right. It's not a novel idea. It's not a new idea. It's not a recent idea. It's actually very old. But, you know, you're one of those advocating for it in this modern era. You know, what type of response do you get when you advocate for something like this?
Well, I mean, you get the usual nuanced response in that we can't take care of our own human rights, so why do you want to give nature rights, right? I think that's the general response. I mean, someone who is new to the topic, not someone who is actually versed or actually a scholar in the topic, trying to analyze the situation. But I think one of the most important things is that we have what you call an anthropocentric way of viewing nature. as I said just now, we look at it and say, what can nature do for me? So for example, you'd say, we should preserve this tree because this tree has certain wood that I can use to build my house. That is not, that is being anthropocentric. It's like saying that, what use can we put this tree? And we know that nature is a very, it's finite resource. So it's something that we really have to, we have to really be very cautious and mindful and have an ecocentric approach in our constitution, in our laws. So these are things that I think is very important.
What have you made of the COP26 conference? What are your thoughts on the targets that are being set? You know, there's still a lot of conversation, a lot of debate. Some of the world leaders still can't agree on a way forward.
Yeah. Well, as an environmentalist, you know, so I'm a bit, I have two sides, two views with relation to the COP and the environmental conference. In a way, I'm a bit skeptical. I mean, like, because we are the ones, human beings, especially if you look at Greta Thunberg and all these young activists, we know that especially the industrialized nations are the ones responsible for the situation where we are today in terms of climate change, massive ecosystem loss, deforestation of the Amazon, which is considered the lungs of the world. And yet we are banking on these I wouldn't say all states, because there are small island states, including Trinidad and Tobago. We are there representing it because we know it's an existential threat to us. It is a matter of life and survival. But when you look at the industrialized states, they are the ones, of course, United States, China, European Union, they are the ones that are they are the ones who put us in this predicament. So it's a trust issue. We are banking on the ones who have put us in this predicament to get us out of this predicament. So I think that a lot of work, as I said, that makes me skeptical. I've spoken to a lot of persons out here who said that we are just undergoing acrobatic talks, or maybe we are doing climate prayers, for example. You're saying we promised to do this. For instance, India has said that, and mind you, India is a very big country, a diverse country, of course, and one of the biggest populations in the world. They have said that deforestation is going to, they are going to reduce their, meet their climate target to be net zero at 2070. So these are issues that we have to look with a critical eye, I think. And every year we hear something that climate change, this is the moment for climate change. And we'll probably hear the same thing again and again and again next year, next 2 years. So I think what I have to say at the end of the backbone rests, I believe, in civil society and indigenous persons, I think, in terms of these negotiations.
And their voices and the vulnerable voices and nailing home their case. I certainly agree with you. But I have to ask you in conclusion, Justin, do you think we will ever live in a world where plants and trees and nature have rights?
Yes, that's definitely the future. We'll be forced to. We'll be forced to do that. Rights of nature, mark my words, will definitely be the future. And there's also an issue which is very integral to that as well. When we talk about nature, we actually speaking about the rights of nature, but we're actually now talking about rights of the earth, because the earth is a living being. It's governed by humans, and also we have the community of life, which is nature, animals. The earth is actually a breathing planet. It's a living planet when you look at that. So we are saying that, okay, rights of nature, forget rights of rivers, rights of mountains, rights of whatever have you. Why can't we actually give earth itself legal rights? I think that is where, and this theory is called earth trusteeship, where states have, and human beings have, a legal responsibility for the health and well-being of the planet. So this is even broader than rights of nature. It's even broader than the environment, which, of course, the environment, when you think about environment, you're thinking about of course, some people think about the air pollution, but we are talking about ecosystems. We are talking about breathing, living ecosystems where we are all connected in the web of life. That is human beings and non-human beings, and we all have to live in harmony. So that is the future of how I look at it for the Caribbean. We have a lot of work to do in that respect, and there are a lot of recommendations I would like to put forward in that respect as well.
You know, listening to you, Justin, made me pull out my phone because I have a picture saved on my phone with a quote on it, and it reads like this. It's a quote from Rabindranath Tagore, and he said, "The one who plants trees knowing that he or she will never sit in their shade has at least started to understand the meaning of life." From Rabindranath Tagore. Yeah. Justin Sobion, thank you so much for joining us all the way across in New Zealand. We really appreciate all the work that you've been doing as an environmentalist, as an environmental lawyer, and we do hope that you chat with us soon again.
Thank you again for having me. It was a pleasure.
Environmental lawyer Justin Sobion talking to us on COP26 Now or Never. Doesn't seem too optimistic about what's happening at COP26, and why should any of us be at this point? There was a headline on CNN.com today that says pretty much world leaders are still at a tug of war to decide which direction we go in this decade, far less far into the future. Thank you so much for joining us for another episode, episode 5, the penultimate episode of a special CNC3 6-part series on the COP26 conference. We'll have our final show on Friday. Until then, have a good night.